At 0240 hours local time, the northern approach to the Armiansk bridge turned a blinding, violent shade of white. A heavy fuel truck sitting practically idle near the exact middle of a massive military column split completely open in a fraction of a second. But the roaring fire that violently erupted out of it did not just stay isolated with the truck. It rapidly ran forward along the tightly packed line of parked vehicles, aggressively found the next fuel tank, and kept right on going. The unmanned drones that started this catastrophic chain reaction had just crossed roughly 60 miles of exposed open ground and shallow, unforgiving salt water just to reach that specific span. And what they found waiting for them in the dark was absolute logistical perfection. Stacked on and directly around a single narrow crossing were as many as 50 heavy Russian transport trucks, heavily loaded with volatile ammunition and highly flammable fuel. Inside of just a few terrifying minutes, the roaring column of fire standing over the bridge reached close to 200 feet into the pitch-black sky, and the eerie, glowing aftermath was clearly visible from over 15 miles out across the desolate flats. But shockingly, none of that was the most unusual part of this entire night. The truly unusual part was the chilling fact that all 50 of those heavily loaded supply trucks were sitting in the exact same place at the exact same time. They had not parked there by accident. They had been deliberately, meticulously pushed there. Imagine a massive, high-speed, four-lane highway suddenly narrowing down to a single, cramped toll booth. Traffic simply does not disappear. It stands still, frozen, in one endless line where anyone watching from high above can easily count it. That is exactly what happened on the approaches to Crimea. For weeks leading up to this fateful night on June 11th, Ukrainian forces, including the 1st Separate Assault Regiment and SBU Alpha Group, had been executing a brilliant, invisible masterclass in supply chain suffocation. They systematically targeted the other critical logistical doors leading into the occupied peninsula. The highly strategic Chonhar bridge, located further to the east, had already taken structural damage so unbelievably severe that military commanders confidently described it as completely unusable for heavy military traffic. Then, crucial crossings near Henichesk and Stavok were ruthlessly struck within the exact same tight window of time. Every single time one of those critical pathways went down, it did not magically reduce the massive amount of fuel and heavy ammunition the military desperately needed to move. It simply removed a safe place to move it through. By deliberately breaking 3 bridges and leaving the 4th one standing, strategists forced the enemy's hand. Cargo traffic along the once bustling R-280 highway plummeted by an astonishing 71%, funneling all that heavy, dangerous cargo directly toward Armiansk. The trucks loaded with gear meant for the Henichesk direction in the Zaporizhzhia sector had absolutely nowhere else to go. They were being staged in a massive, unavoidable queue, waiting their turn to cross the last functioning lifeline. But creating that monumental, miles-long traffic jam was only the first piece of a much darker, far more lethal puzzle. The Perekop isthmus is absolutely not a place that forgives tactical mistakes. It sits at the very top of Crimea, forming a remarkably narrow strip of land, only a few treacherous miles wide, with unforgiving salt lagoons violently pressing in from both sides. There is absolutely no scenic route hidden away through it. There is no wide, grassy field a panicked driver can violently pull into when the sky suddenly starts falling. Whatever heavy cargo physically goes overland between the mainland and the Crimean Peninsula absolutely must go through a remarkably small number of fixed, inflexible crossings. A heavy truck column sitting on the Perekop isthmus cannot simply turn around and retreat. It cannot spread out to minimize potential splash damage. It cannot pull off the raised roadway and desperately wait somewhere safe, because in this barren wasteland, there is simply no safe haven. It is nothing but a raised, exposed road, dark salt water flanking both sides, and the massive rear bumper of the military vehicle stopped directly in front of it. The entire approach is entirely flat, consisting of salt pans, shallow stagnant water, and low scrub brush, with almost nothing that stands taller than an average fence post. Once a massive logistical column officially commits to that unforgiving stretch of causeway, it is permanently committed
until it reaches the other side. The line of 50 trucks, loaded with explosive cargo, was trapped in a geographic straitjacket, blindly trusting that their layered defense umbrellas would protect them from what lurked above. And what was rapidly coming for them through the freezing darkness was entirely invisible to the naked eye.
You cannot shoot down what your multi-million-dollar radar screens tell you simply does not exist. For a low-flying, stealthy strike drone, the flat, desolate geography of the Perekop isthmus is a wildly mixed blessing. There are absolutely no towering ridgelines or deep valleys for an unmanned aerial vehicle to cleverly slip behind. But on the flip side, there is also absolutely nothing for a sophisticated ground-based radar system to easily see past. When an object flies at a remarkably low altitude directly over completely flat saltwater and salt pans, the physical curvature of the Earth's horizon itself does most of the heavy lifting when it comes to concealing the incoming threat. A highly advanced radar array mounted on a heavy military vehicle just a few meters off the cold ground can only look so far down the horizon before the natural, unavoidable curve of the Earth violently rips the target away from its electronic vision. The operators, utilizing highly advanced platforms like the Behemoth and Firepoint drones, brought their lethal payload in incredibly low, hugging the absolute deck under the total cover of pure darkness. For the vast majority of the agonizing flight run, the only critical thing that mattered was staying perfectly under that invisible, unforgiving radar line. A massive military convoy stuck in a severe traffic queue does something a moving convoy never does. It patiently waits. It completely stops. The lead truck is totally paralyzed because the truck ahead of it is paralyzed. Hitting a moving column means nervously solving for a complex mathematical location it has not even reached yet. But none of that applies to 50 static trucks trapped on a narrow bridge. But a blind radar wasn't the only piece of multi-million-dollar technology about to be rendered completely useless.
The Pantsir S1 is highly touted as being the ultimate self-contained mechanical bodyguard. It is a single, heavily armored vehicle carrying its own active search radar, its own precision tracking radar, advanced surface-to-air missiles, and a devastating rapid-fire autocannon. It is purposely built to be totally self-contained, not needing a complex, broader network to function properly, and typically requiring barely any warning to start violently shooting. On pristine, theoretical paper, its rapid reaction time is impressively measured in single-digit seconds, from initial threat detection to massive missile launch. And against a standard threat aggressively coming at a single heavily defended point, that is usually more than enough to survive. But the critical thing being defended at the Armiansk crossing was absolutely not a single isolated point. It was an exposed line, a highly vulnerable bridge, a lengthy approach road, and a massive column of explosive vehicles strung out across several miles of desolate causeway. Picture an elite goalkeeper trained his entire exhausting career to brutally stop penalty kicks, suddenly being asked to defend a slow-moving ball rolling along the grassy ground somewhere entirely behind him. Every single skill is very real, but none of them apply to the impossible geometry he has just been handed. A highly trained air defense crew has to rapidly detect the sudden contact, properly classify it as a lethal threat rather than mere background clutter, violently slew their weapons onto it, and fully commit to the shot. Even on the fastest end of the spectrum, that complex sequence eats up several precious seconds, and several seconds at a low-level cruise speed equals thousands of feet of ground effortlessly covered by the incoming drone. The system could have protected a tiny dot on a map, but the drone simply flew past the tiny sliver of road the system was covering and slammed directly into the unprotected part it wasn't. And yet, an even more advanced invisible shield was about to be shattered in the most embarrassing way possible.
Electronic warfare is often widely considered to be the silent, invisible killer of the modern high-tech battlefield. Around these fixed, vulnerable crossings, the military had made a very strong habit of constantly parking highly advanced jamming systems like the R-330Zh Zhitel. This is a highly mobile, incredibly powerful jamming station whose sole, desperate job is to completely smother and drown out the delicate electronic signals a standard drone desperately depends on to fly safely. It aggressively goes after precise satellite navigation bands, and it brutally attacks the live video control link connecting the fragile drone to its distant pilot. Inside its massive, invisible coverage area,
It can easily turn the sky into something remarkably close to a dead zone for absolutely anything that desperately needs to hear a guiding voice from home. Against a standard first-person view quadcopter actively flown by an operator nervously watching a live video feed, that powerful jamming wall is basically an instant kill switch. If you forcefully cut the vital link, the once lethal aircraft instantly becomes nothing more than a dumb, unguided falling object, crashing harmlessly into the cold dirt. But aggressive, wide-area jamming only actually works on something that is still actively listening for complex instructions. A long-range, sophisticated strike drone that has already been securely given its final target coordinates and is blindly flying a heavily loaded, pre-programmed route is absolutely not waiting for any new instructions. It is not asking a single question to its operator. It is ruthlessly executing a cold, hard, unfeeling decision that was firmly finalized long before it ever entered the massive jamming envelope. Shouting highly advanced electronic noise at it is exactly like angrily shouting at a sealed letter you already dropped into the dark mailbox. The words are incredibly loud, the message is intensely real, but the envelope keeps going exactly where it was addressed without hesitation. The electronic defense was perfectly configured to stop the most common remote-controlled threat, but the lethal payload silently arriving from the dark sky was absolutely not that threat. And when that drone finally reached its predetermined coordinates, the sky literally fell down on the crossing. Fuel does not simply explode the way flashy Hollywood movies desperately want you to believe. It forcefully vents. When a high-explosive drone payload rips into heavy military transport, a ruptured tank throws a massive cloud of highly volatile vapor first. That vapor aggressively finds oxygen in the air, and that air instantly finds the intense heat of the initial blast. And then the entire massive cloud violently lights up all at once in a blinding flash that moves infinitely faster than any human being on that trapped road could ever hope to react to. The initial heavy transport truck it came from was completely wiped out in the very first second of the strike, but the equally heavy trucks parked tightly on either side of it were not instantly gone. They were fully engulfed in an intense, roaring fire, which is infinitely worse, because now they acted as massive raging heat sources parked directly against the exact next highly explosive tank in the long line. That is exactly how a trapped military column slowly dies, not all at once, but in horrifying order. The hungry fire literally walked the dense queue of vehicles, fuel, then more fuel, and then it reached something incredibly heavier. Military-grade artillery ammunition does not actually need a direct kinetic hit to brutally detonate. It only needs time and intense temperature, and a violently burning vehicle sitting right alongside it happily supplies ample amounts of both. The very first massive cook-off dramatically changed the entire sound of the Dark Night. It started with a sharper, significantly flatter crack, then another, and then a chaotic, deafening run of them rapidly overlapping. Heavy brass cases violently went off inside covered truck beds. The metal beds violently tore apart. Lethal, jagged fragments violently crossed the narrow road and mercilessly punched gaping holes in the desperate vehicles that had not fully caught fire yet. And gaping holes in full fuel tanks are exactly how you get even more highly flammable liquid pouring out into the open. The terrified drivers ran, but there was absolutely nowhere to run to that wasn't the blazing causeway itself. But the trucks weren't the only things dying in the heat that night.
Concrete and reinforced steel are incredibly strong and resilient materials, right up until they meet sustained, highly localized hellfire. The bridge crossing at Armiansk was absolutely never engineered or designed to take the kind of brutal, relentless beating it absorbed that night. Heavy structures generally do not mind holding immense amounts of cold, static weight. What they absolutely cannot tolerate is sustained extreme heat coupled with violent, unpredictable shock waves. The intense, unyielding fire, roaring from 50 separate military vehicles, slowly pulled the inherent structural strength directly out of the bridge's steel supports while it was still physically standing. The repeated, deafening blast loading from cooking off artillery shells aggressively, violently worked the critical expansion joints to their absolute breaking point. Somewhere in that terrifying, chaotic sequence of overlapping explosions, the solid deck simply stopped being a usable road
and started being a shattered, sagging collection of broken pieces that used to be a road. It sagged heavily along one major structural span, violently cracked completely through the driving surface, with massively burning husks of vehicles still sitting heavily on the parts that hadn't fully collapsed yet. Roughly 2 minutes. That is about how long the useful, functional part of that entire catastrophic chain reaction realistically took. At the end of that short, violent window, the massive logistical column could absolutely not advance because the road ahead was completely gone. It could not throw it in reverse because the road behind was totally blocked by the burning vehicles that had already stopped. Everything that had been desperately funneled through that single critical crossing was now sitting heavily on that crossing, totally eliminated. And absolutely none of it was ever going to reach the front lines. And the aftermath of that structural failure would alter the entire geometry of the southern front.
Destroying an enemy army doesn't always mean facing them in a bloody head-on clash on an open battlefield. The true strategic genius of this devastating drone campaign was incredibly clean and beautifully executed. They didn't just casually blow up a concrete bridge, they completely bankrupted the entire regional logistics network. The undeniable measure of absolute success was not just that the physical structure fell apart, it was that nobody on the opposing side was ever going to bother attempting to use it again. A severely damaged bridge is a very complex engineering problem, but a severely damaged bridge with 50 actively burning, exploding supply trucks sitting directly on top of it is a nightmare bridge that absolutely nobody can safely get combat engineers onto. Strategic, this was never just one night's lucky work. It was the absolute final, devastating move in a brilliant sequence. By systematically dropping the other crossings, they removed every single safe option. They purposefully allowed the remaining option to carry a massive load it was never historically meant to carry alone, essentially letting the logistical planners build their own massive pyre. Now, the supply machine has been forced to desperately construct highly vulnerable pontoon bridges and incredibly slow temporary earthen bypasses. A deeply entrenched peninsula absolutely does not have to be physically captured by infantry to stop functioning as a reliable military rear area. It simply has to become somewhere that crucial things are incredibly hard to get into and remarkably hard to get out of. Which leaves us looking at a future where every single logistical movement comes with a deadly price tag.
In the end, modern warfare is rarely won by the loudest, most aggressive tank charge. It is almost always quiet, ruthlessly decided by the complex, unseen logistics that dictate whether those heavily armored vehicles even have enough fuel to turn their massive engines on. By systematically funneling an entire regional supply chain into a single, inescapable bottleneck at Armiansk, the strikes didn't just physically break a few concrete bridges, they successfully induced a massive, catastrophic heart attack in the critical supply lines. Every single ton of ammunition and fuel must now navigate incredibly slow, highly vulnerable pontoons or earthen bypasses, drastically increasing handling time, fatal delays, and the terrifying risk of follow-up strikes. The silent, invisible power of logistics has permanently transformed a safe corridor into a highly lethal trap, and it leaves a chilling, deeply thought-provoking question for anyone watching this grinding conflict unfold. When your absolute only overland routes are totally wiped out, and you are desperately forced to fall back on fragile ferries and temporary pontoon crossings, which of those two flimsy options do you actually think will manage to survive the longest?